Human evolution is not optional. It is part of the engine of creation itself. Nothing in existence remains fixed. Everything changes, reorganizes, adapts, and evolves. So the real question is not whether evolution will happen, but whether we will be ready for the next phase of it. The first phase of human evolution is survival. In that phase, humanity organizes itself around food, shelter, protection, tribe, reproduction, territory, and power. But even within survival, evolution is already happening in many directions at once. Leadership evolves, economy evolves, social structure evolves, tools evolve, technology evolves, ease of living evolves, quality of life evolves. That is how humanity moves from tribe to village, from village to kingdom, from kingdom to nation, and from nation to interdependent systems. But evolution does not happen only outside us. It happens inside us too. It is not only biological or technological. Knowledge evolves, values evolve, meaning evolves, faith evolves in interpretation, spirituality evolves in depth, consciousness evolves in what it can recognize. The meaning of life in an early survival phase is not the same as the meaning of life in a complex civilizational phase. Even meditation, self-understanding, and spiritual experience change with the level of civilization and awareness we have reached. What evolution is really doing is moving existence toward greater stability. A thing evolves only if it can preserve continuity, reinforce itself, and survive through changing conditions. This is not true only for living organisms. It is true for physical systems, social systems, civilizations, minds, knowledge systems, and faith systems. Evolution is the gradual reorganization of continuity into more stable forms. Structurally, evolution stabilizes itself in three broad ways: by dividing, by merging, and by adding new dimensions or layers. That is why decentralization can be a technique of stability. Division is not always weakness. Sometimes a system must divide at one level in order to remain stable at a higher one. In the same way, unity is not the destruction of plurality. Real unity is the right ordering of plurality. Stability often needs both separation at one level and coherence at a higher level. That is why the next stable phase of humanity requires greater unity. As humanity becomes more socialized, the demand for higher coherence increases. Small-scale systems can survive with division. Large-scale civilization cannot remain stable through hatred, fragmentation, hoarding, and endless competition. The next phase requires greater coordination, greater coherence, greater shared responsibility, and less destructive division. But this does not mean forced sameness. It means distributed unity. Many societies, one higher coherence. We are now entering a phase where humanity begins to understand the system itself. We are no longer only trying to survive. We are beginning to understand existence, mind, society, faith, continuity, guidance, and the law of evolution itself. This is the real turning point. Evolution is starting to become conscious. Humanity is beginning not only to live inside the process, but to recognize the structure of the process. That is the real meaning of the present phase. Evolution is moving from blind adaptation to conscious understanding. And once a system begins to understand itself, the possibility of the next phase opens. Why theory matters because it is presented as knowledge of the engine of existence itself. It does not treat creation, continuity, evolution, identity, guidance, mind, society, faith, and meaning as separate subjects. It tries to show that they all belong to one system. That is why it is not framed as just another theory among theories. It is framed as knowledge about how the system itself works. Once such knowledge appears, evolution no longer remains only something that happens to humanity blindly. A new phase begins. Humanity starts understanding not just events inside life, but the structure by which life, mind, society, and civilization move at all. That is why knowledge becomes the key driver of phase change. First comes knowing, then understanding, then conscious participation. A civilization changes deeply when it begins to understand the law of its own becoming. In that sense, Y-theory gives a new perspective on evolution. It says the next phase is not merely better tools, faster technology, or more comfort. It is conscious evolution. But conscious evolution here does not mean artificial spirituality, shallow manifestation, or ego-based control. It means understanding how stability forms, how fragmentation happens, how societies collapse, how minds align, how continuity is preserved, and how guidance supports a system. Only then can humanity begin to build structures that support the next phase instead of resisting it. That is also why Y-theory is presented as unifying knowledge. It gives science, faith, morality, society, and consciousness a common frame. Science matters because structure must be understood clearly. Faith matters because guidance stabilizes evolution. Morality matters because a destructive pattern cannot be carried into a higher phase. Society matters because no higher civilization can emerge from hatred, division, and selfishness. Mind matters because the next phase depends on self-reflection, alignment, and coherence. So the theory tries to show that these are not competing domains. They are different faces of the same evolutionary process. This is where its importance becomes practical. If humanity understands the system, then it can stop living only reactively. It can begin to organize itself with greater clarity. It can build social, moral, intellectual, and civilizational conditions that preserve continuity rather than destroy it. That is the real meaning of engineering evolution, not controlling life from ego, but participating in the movement of existence with understanding, guidance, and responsibility. So why theory matters? Because it gives a civilizational perspective on the next phase. It says humanity may be reaching the point where it can understand the architecture of evolution itself. And once that happens, the question is no longer only how to survive inside the world. The question becomes how to become fit for the next stable form of humanity. Faith matters first as guidance. A guided system is more stable than an unguided one. That is the core point. Civilization does not rise only through intelligence, power, or technology. It also needs direction, restraint, meaning, and correction. Without guidance, human systems drift into desire, ego, confusion, competition, and fragmentation. That is why faith should not be reduced to tribe, ritual, or blind obedience. At its deepest level, it functions as guidance for order, reflection, stability, and higher continuity. The problem is not faith itself. The problem is shallow religion without deep understanding. But faith is not only guidance. When read deeply, the major religious traditions appear to preserve the behavior of the existence engine itself. How continuity works, why self-reflection matters, why morality matters, why gathering matters, why society matters, and how a human being is prepared for a later phase without even fully knowing it yet. In that sense, faith has been training humanity structurally all along. It has been keeping minds, communities, and civilizations aligned enough that when the time of deeper understanding comes, some will already be prepared for it. That is why faith is not just philosophy. It is a structural necessity for survival and continuity across long civilizational time. This is also why faith itself evolves in understanding. Earlier phases received guidance in symbolic, moral, prophetic, and communal form. That was necessary. Knowledge was not yet at the stage where the structure itself could be clearly understood. But now the situation changes. The present phase is not against faith. It is the evolution of understanding faith more deeply. Why theory matters here because it gives a structural explanation for why guidance is necessary in the first place. It says a guided system is more likely to remain coherent than an unguided one. So what faith carried in symbolic and moral form, why theory tries to decode in structural form. So the deeper message is this: humanity is not only evolving in science, society, and technology. Humanity is also evolving in how it understands guidance itself. Faith brought humanity forward through long cycles of loss, collapse, and civilizational break. Now understanding is catching up to guidance. This is the phase where the structure behind faith begins to become visible. And once that happens, religion is no longer seen as merely inherited practice. It becomes readable as a preparation system for higher coherence, higher stability, and the next stage of conscious evolution. History shows that human beings have always tried to understand reality, the meaning of life, and the way out of confusion, suffering, and limitation. Spirituality was used in many ways to understand reality, to influence reality, and to try to exit reality. But this next phase is different. What is becoming clear now is that evolution does not ask for one-sided development. A person cannot become fit for the next phase by being only spiritual, only scientific, only emotional, or only moral. The next phase demands whole-person development. A human being must evolve scientifically, logically, morally, spiritually, emotionally, and socially at the same time. That means becoming empathetic, compassionate, caring, truth-seeking, logically clear, spiritually grounded, and morally disciplined together. A one-sided person may survive in fragments, but cannot become fit for a higher identity. The same applies to society. The future cannot be built on exploitation, border hatred, controlled scarcity, manipulation, and division. If humanity is moving toward a higher coherence, then social evolution must also move toward structures that support shared knowledge, shared technology, shared responsibility, wider access, and better distribution. This does not mean one dead centralized empire. Stability may still require multiple countries, multiple regions, and distributed forms of organization. But they must function as parts of one higher human coherence, not as hostile fragments tearing each other apart. That is why economic reform is not just politics. It is part of evolution itself. When money and resources are used to keep people divided and dependent, the species remains socially developed but evolutionarily immature. A more stable phase will require systems that support dignity rather than hoarding, participation rather than structural slavery. At the same time, humanity may remain administratively diverse while becoming civilizationally united. The goal is not chaos and not total centralization, but protected coherence. Stable distributed structures can include multiple nations, easier movement, cooperative systems, shared development, and shared technology, while still containing destructive patterns so they do not collapse the whole. As basic needs become more stable, more people will naturally begin asking deeper questions. Who am I? What is consciousness? Why do I exist? What is suffering for? What is evolution trying to produce? At that point, self-reflection stops being only personal and becomes collective. Meditation, inquiry, morality, science, and faith begin to converge. A civilization that self-reflects together becomes capable of a higher coherence. That is the real transition. Not just more intelligence, but more synchronized intelligence. Not just more individuals, but a more coherent collective mind. The real turning point is not time alone, but knowledge. A phase changes when a system begins to understand itself. First comes knowing, then understanding, then experience, then participation, and only after that, construction. That is why Y-theory matters in this framework. It is presented not as just another theory, but as knowledge of how existence, continuity, evolution, mind, faith, guidance, and creation itself are structured. The biggest shift is not merely that humanity is evolving. It is that humanity may be reaching the point where it can understand the architecture of evolution itself. Once that knowledge appears, two serious possibilities remain open. One is that the larger system is already built, and we are already inside it. The other is that humanity must still evolve enough to consciously build or stabilize such a system. The first seems plausible because many traditions speak as if access is already possible. Some people report contact with deeper identity or prior continuity. And faith often speaks of transition and sorting more than of a long technological construction timeline. But this remains a gray area, not a final conclusion. The important point is that both possibilities demand the same response. Humanity must align, evolve, become more coherent, and prepare for participation in the next phase. That is also why self-knowledge alone is not the final answer. Spirituality has always tried to understand reality, influence reality, or exit reality. But in this framework, private realization by itself is incomplete. An isolated fragment of consciousness cannot fully understand the pure source alone. Deeper participation requires a larger coherence, not just an individual mystical state. The meaning of spirituality therefore expands. It is no longer only about personal escape or inward peace. It becomes part of a larger task, helping the whole move toward a more self-reflective and more coherent condition. In that sense, self-understanding still matters, but it now sits inside collective evolution, rather than replacing it. This is where the creator and creation idea becomes central. The next phase is not just more information in the abstract. It is the possibility of understanding creation from both sides, as one who exists within it, and as one who participates in building structure. Not because the pure source becomes identical with us, but because the most stable way for creation to understand itself is to experience both the feeling of the created and the burden of the creator. That is why building structure matters, not as ego fantasy, but as part of the path of understanding. In that state, continuity, responsibility, guidance, morality, and stability are no longer theoretical ideas. They become lived realities. Through that, creation understands itself more deeply, and through that deeper understanding, it approaches the creator more stably, while still recognizing that the pure source remains beyond the engine itself. So the practical consequence is very precise. If the knowledge is now available, then this is a phase-changing moment, whether the larger structure is already there or still ahead of us. In a hypothetical reading, reality may already be a stable looped structure in which our time-bound life is only one axis of a larger order. Or it may be that humanity is being driven toward building such stabilized structure consciously. But in both cases, the work remains the same. Understand the engine, deepen coherence, evolve in all directions, and prepare for the next identity. The next phase will not be reached by science alone, faith alone, or spirituality alone. It requires an integrated mind, an integrated civilization, and a more conscious participation in the law of existence itself. If the structure is already there, then the possibility of exiting, participating, or aligning with it is already there too. The knowledge is not hidden in the sense of being absent. It appears across traditions, practices, and human experiences, even if people decode it in very different ways. Some seek to understand reality, some try to manipulate reality, and some try to exit reality. That is why this phase is not only about private awakening. It is about correctly understanding what the system is, what it is for, and what kind of participation it is calling for. In this framework, the future movement will happen anyway. The real issue is not whether the phase changes, but who becomes fit for it. So the call is not to sit back and wait, and not to save yourself privately alone. The call is to understand, align, evolve, and help your surroundings become more coherent by reducing hatred, deepening empathy, understanding faith more deeply, understanding structure more clearly, and making the world around you less fragmented. That is how the transition is expedited, not by force, but by increasing coherence where you stand. At the same time, the system has both sides. The same reality that allows alignment also allows exploitation. Some patterns approach the system through guidance, self-reflection, morality, and higher coherence. Others approach it through domination, manipulation, ritual control, manifestation, deception, and narrow self-interest. They may understand enough of the lower structure to control parts of reality, but they do not represent the full arc of evolution. Their use of knowledge is short-range, power-centered, and unstable. They keep people distracted, dependent, divided, and enslaved to lower aims because that is how they preserve their control. So, the wake-up call matters, not because evolution depends on them, but because people can still be trapped by them and lose readiness for the next closure. The point of this chapter, then, is not fear. It is discernment. The system is real. Both paths are real. And the task is to stop feeding the side that narrows consciousness and start strengthening the side that prepares humanity for higher participation. In that sense, readiness is no longer only personal. It becomes civilizational. A person who understands only for themselves has not yet completed the meaning of the phase. The real movement is to become coherent yourself and help coherence spread around you. Because if humanity is moving toward a higher participation, then each local increase in truth, empathy, moral discipline, structural understanding, and social coherence becomes part of that larger preparation. That is the practical meaning of the message. Understand the system. Do not be deceived by its lower exploitative uses, and help make your environment fit for the next stage rather than leaving it trapped in division. We are now living in a phase where the signs of transition are becoming harder to ignore. The world feels more chaotic, more unstable, more manipulated, and at the same time more exposed. More people are beginning to question power, media, economy, work culture, and the structures that keep human beings busy, dependent, distracted, and divided. More people are noticing concentrated control, narrative shaping, artificial urgency, and systems that seem designed less for human flourishing and more for managed obedience. At the same time, technology is accelerating through AI, robotics, biology, data, and automation. Manual human effort is being replaced, older economic roles are being destabilized, and whole populations are being made to feel disposable through hunger, poverty, war, and structural exclusion. Whether one interprets all of this politically, spiritually, or structurally, one thing is becoming clear. The world is changing, and it is changing fast. That is why this knowledge becomes relevant now. In this framework, heaven and hell are not only distant religious images. Hell is what remains stranded, cut off, or left in lower disintegration. Heaven is the waiting participation phase within a larger coherence before the next full transition is complete. The megamind may already exist as a higher field of participation, but may not yet be self-reflective enough to move fully to the next stage. That means participation can continue through many nodes: faith, science, meaning, service, and creation. But one-sided development is still not enough. To be fit for the next identity, a mind has to evolve across the whole band: faith, logic, technology, morality, empathy, care, and understanding together. A person who develops only one part remains incomplete. A civilization that develops power without coherence also remains incomplete. Readiness is therefore not a private mood, it is whole pattern fitness. That is why the final question of this phase is not whether humanity will evolve. It will. The real question is whether we are fit for the next closure, or whether we remain trapped in lower loops while the phase changes around us. Are we only preparing privately, or are we helping coherence grow around us? Are we becoming capable of participating in the next identity, or are we still feeding fragmentation, hatred, distraction, and control? This is why the point of the message is not fear and not fantasy. It is wake up. The world now has the communication threshold to spread such knowledge instantly. One post, one idea, one coherent explanation can now travel across millions. The problem is no longer only access. The problem is consolidation. People are already noticing patterns, already pointing at manipulation, already seeing that many fields are connected, but they still lack one coherent law that joins all the dots. In this framework, that is where why theory matters. Not because it can be fully delivered in one post, but because it claims to provide the missing structural bridge across science, faith, mind, society, evolution, and creation itself. So this last chapter becomes very simple in its final meaning. The movement is already happening. The world is giving signs of it. Knowledge is spreading. Structures are shaking. Old systems are being exposed. New powers are rising. Human beings are being forced to ask deeper questions. The issue now is not passive observation. The issue is readiness. Not only self-understanding, but self-understanding plus collective preparation. Not only private spirituality, but helping the world around you become less fragmented, less hateful, less blind, and more coherent. Because the next phase will not belong to the strongest body, the richest system, or the loudest ideology. It will belong to the most coherent pattern of humanity. That is the real meaning of this post. Final wake-up, final preparation, and a final question. Are we becoming fit for the next phase, or are we still choosing the lower loops while the world moves on?